Welcome, everybody. I have Lincoln Cannon here, who is the founder, the president, one of the board directors, and a member, and also the CEO of the Mormon Transhumanist Association. Welcome,
That's right.
Lincoln.
Thank you, Adam. Good to be talking with you.
Good to be talking with you too. Yeah, we originally planned to do this quite a bit earlier, but because of some technical issues and scheduling issues, gee, it was yeah, a bit of a tough call to get things all scheduled and working properly. But mostly that was on my side, so it's not your fault, Lincoln. But
And
thanks
here
for
we
being
are.
so patient. All right. So, would you like to describe, like in short, who you are and where you came from and your background in the church and I guess how that relates to the Mormon Transhumanist Association?
Sure. Yeah. I'm a lifelong Mormon. I was born to parents who were Mormons, and they were well. My mother actually was born to a partly Catholic family. Her father was a non-practicing Mormon, but her mother was a very practicing Catholic. So my mother was raised as a Catholic and later converted to Mormonism before I was born. And then my father is a descendant of lots of Mormons going back for generations. So I was born into a Mormon family, raised a Mormon. I went to church every week. We were taught by my parents to say prayers, all the standard Sunday school type stuff that you imagine for church. And eventually, as most Mormons do, when I was 19, I served a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is the largest Mormon denomination, the church I'm a member of, and went to France on that mission for 2 years.
Sacre bleu.
Sacre
That's
bleu.
really bad French. Sorry. Can you?
Yeah, it was actually a wonderful place to go on a mission. I really enjoyed it a lot. And in fact, my wife is French. She was a missionary for the church at the same time, at the same location. We first met there while we were missionaries. And then later on, after our missions,
Scandalous.
it could have been. You never know. I won't let all the secrets.
Okay.
But but later on, when we were no longer missionaries, we actually started dating. She came to the United States, and eventually we got married. So that I actually met my wife while we were both missionaries. And since that time, my relationship with Mormonism has always been one of an evolution. I'm always learning a lot about my religion, about others' religions, and how I feel about it, how they feel about it, how it works into the bigger picture of human civilization. I've always been a student of those kinds of things. And so about let's see, it would have been in 2005-ish for the first time I heard about transhumanism. I'd never heard the word before that time. When I first heard about it, I started reading about it, started reading the ideas of the major proponents of transhumanism, and I said to myself, I'm a transhumanist. And the ideas that I was hearing matched many ideas I had had throughout my life and resonated deeply with me. And so I embraced that identity and talked about those ideas with others that I knew well, and those ideas resonated with them very strongly also. And as a consequence of various experiences, we ended up deciding, hey, we want to organize this association, the Mormon Transhumanist Association, and promote this relationship that we've identified between our religion and transhumanism and share it with other people because we think that it can help them and that it would be a good thing. So that's kind of how I got into transhumanism. Frankly, I sincerely feel like I've been a transhumanist my entire life. That might sound strange for people that come from different kinds of religious backgrounds, but that's not so strange from a Mormon background. I'll try to give you a little bit of flavor of why that may be the case. In Mormonism, we have this idea called eternal progression. Humanity is supposed to learn and self-improve perpetually until we learn to become gods ourselves. And that to many people sounds very egotistical, but it's also important to remember that the kind of God that Mormons are talking about when they talk about becoming gods is the kind of God exemplified by Jesus. So it's not just the all-powerful God who can shoot lightning bolts or something like that. It's this idea that God is both radically creative and powerful, but also radically compassionate. And Godhood is not just about the individual, it's about relationships. It's about charity and love, persuasion, caring for each other, serving each other. Those kinds of things are as essential to the kind of Godhood we're talking about as the capacity to create worlds would be. So, as a child with Mormon parents, I was taught, that's what I should be. That's what I should be learning to become. Is this person exemplified by Jesus who is radically compassionate and creative, and that if we do all the right things, we work really hard, we study really hard, we concern ourselves both with spiritual and temporal education, that we can become like that. So that's what many Mormon children learn. That's what I learned, and so you can start to see from that why those sorts of ideas would naturally lead a person to embracing transhumanism.
Right. So, a couple of questions. You mentioned that, like, your father had relatives in the Mormon Church.
Yeah.
Were they any famous ones? So, like,
Yes.
was you related to Joseph Smith or Brigham Young or somebody like that?
Through legal relationships, yes, to your last questions, to Brigham Young and Joseph Smith ultimately. But through blood relationships to other well-known Mormons, they might not be as well-known outside of Mormonism as Joseph Smith and Brigham Young are, but they're well-known within Mormonism. My last name, Cannon, comes from George Q. Cannon, who was an apostle of the early Mormon church. He was in the first presidency. What the first presidency is, it's the top governing body of the LDS Church. It consists typically of three people: the president of the church and a couple of counselors. So my ancestor, George Q. Cannon, was a counselor to Brigham Young, Wilford Woodruff, John Taylor, who were subsequent presidents of the LDS Church, and would have eventually become president of the church himself had he not died shortly before he would have become president. So yeah, many Mormons are familiar with George Q. Cannon. My father is a descendant of George Q. Cannon, as am I, of course. And so yeah, that we have a long history of family in Mormonism, going back through more lines than just my father's paternal line. My father's maternal line, of course, goes back with a lot of Mormon history. And then also I mentioned that my mother is the child of a person who at the time was not a practicing Mormon, but his family also goes back through Mormon pioneer
Right.
history.
So they crossed America and settled in Utah at some stage, right?
That's right. So George Q. Cannon, as just one example, many of my ancestors were pioneers in different ways, but George Q. Cannon in particular, he traveled from England, well, the Isle of Man in particular, with his family, which is a small island
Yeah.
in the ocean between England and Ireland. He traveled from there. He was converted by Mormon missionaries over there in England. He traveled with his family to meet up with the Mormons who at the time were living in Nauvoo, which, as I recall, I think at that time was the largest city in Illinois. He met up there. He met up with Joseph Smith, met Brigham Young at that point. Eventually, of course, Joseph Smith was killed there in that area. And then Brigham Young took up the leadership after kind of a succession crisis. And George Q. Cannon and his family accompanied the pioneers from Illinois westward into Utah, which is, of course, at the time, it wasn't a state. They thought they were leaving the United States, and their intention was to set up their own country, the state of Deseret. That didn't turn out so well over time. The U.S. military eventually came, and there was never a war never really broke out, but they were very close to it at one point in time. So, yeah, my family converted a lot of them from the England area, and were pioneers into Utah.
Okay, that's interesting. So when you first stumbled upon what transhumanist writing or media did you first stumble upon, and what was it that first stood out for you?
Yeah, that's interesting. You should ask. It actually came from two separate directions, and at the time, I didn't know that they were related. So there were two very important figures that I kind of came across at about the same time. One of them was Nick Bostrom, the simulation argument in particular,
Right.
and the other was Ray Kurzweil and his ideas related to the technological singularity. I
Which book was
encountered
it? Which book was it at that time? Was it
Uh,
the Age of Spiritual Machines,
no, it
or was
was
it just an article?
some internet stuff that he had written, and eventually The Singularity is Near is
Hmm.
the book that came out around that time. So I had no idea at the time that those two persons were kind of related to each other in transhumanist singularitarian circles. I encountered them for different because I was researching different things, and both of them have strong parallels with ideas that I've cared a lot about throughout my life and parallels with my religion. Um, and as I studied them and shared them with friends and talked about them, we discovered that there are these connections. And that's when, through kind of looking at those, we eventually became aware of the World Transhumanist Association, as it was called at that time. It's since become Humanity Plus, of course. And once we
Of
discovered the
which
World
I'm on the
Transhumanist,
board. Yeah.
yes, exactly. And we became acquainted with the World Transhumanist Association, and we decided, hey, we want to get involved with this group. Some of us joined the World Transhumanist Association, and we proposed to the World Transhumanist Association that we'd like to start a a religious interest group affiliated with the World Transhumanist Association, because at the time the World Transhumanist Association was advertising their interest in creating interest group based affiliates. I don't remember exactly how they worded it. So we approached them with this idea, and there was a debate on the board of directors at the time. I've heard bits and pieces about how the debate went down, but the end result was that the majority of the board voted in favor of affiliating with the Mormon Transhumanist Association, which helped us quite a bit early on in organizing the association, because it attracted some people to our association that had already been interested in the World Transhumanist Association. And
Hmm.
it was good to get that kind of support from people who were well known in the transhumanist community, so that we wouldn't just be immediately rejected in our efforts to talk with others about our angle and our perspective on transhumanist ideas. We could say at least, hey, listen, you know, take us at least this seriously, the fact that, the leaders of your movement took us seriously enough to affiliate with us. So, give us a minute to explain why, we think the way we do. Don't just immediately reject us as crazy wackos.
Okay. Well, hence the reason why I'm interviewing you. So,
There we go.
well, I don't go out of my way to interview crazy wackos, but sometimes I find it interesting. It's good food for thought because these people are creative. They spin off new ideas. Just yeah, sort of. But not to say that you're one of those. Let me just say. So let me just ask. What now? There's a lot of Mormons in the church. How many Mormons are there? Just quickly.
Well, um, so when I say Mormon, I'm referring to a whole movement of people. The largest denomination of Mormonism is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Right.
So
And
I'll
that's
talk
that's
about them.
what you're part of, right?
Yes, yeah,
Yes.
and it's by far the largest. Most Mormons you'll meet in the world are going to be members of this organization.
Sure. Yeah.
And
But
so theoretically, there's like, I don't know, 14 million members of this organization.
that's
But
almost the size of the population of Australia.
yeah, that
Right.
may be the case.
We're over 20 now, but like that's a lot of members. Okay. Yeah. Theoretically,
Now,
though. Yeah.
theoretically, that's
Hmm.
right, because not all of them are practicing, and not all of them probably still identify, even though they're still on their records, but haven't removed their names for whatever reason. People have tried to estimate how many of those are actually practicing members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And, I'm comfortable with saying, maybe somewhere between one third to one half of that number are actually practicing to some extent. And of course, there's differing extents to which those members are practicing their religious faith. So, another interesting number related to that I'll throw out there is that it's my understanding currently that there are about the same number of Mormons and Jews in the world. And as it turns out, also about the same percentage of Mormons and Jews in the United States. So a lot of people, are more comfortable with, the extent to which Jews are part of society, and they just may not know that there's as many Mormons out there as there are Jews these days.
Yeah. Right. So that's a quite a significant number. However, from my understanding, I don't think Jews are proselytizing religion. They're
Yeah,
pretty
for the
much
most
close
part.
knit. They maybe even a bit against accepting new members, or yeah, they don't seem
Yeah,
to be out there sort of, hey, we're going to convert the world religion.
that's right. Mormons are, of course, very focused on proselyting. We do a lot of work there,
Right.
and that annoys some people to no end.
Do people confuse you with Jehovah's Witnesses often?
Yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
people do that. When I was a missionary in
Does
France,
that
I had
annoy
people.
you?
Um, they're very different religions, very very different.
They're both
So
Christianity.
yes, they're both Christian, but our interpretations of Christianity are remarkably different. And they would say the same thing. If you asked a Jehovah's Witness, how close are you to Mormon? Oh, there's big differences between us and Mormons. So,
Yeah.
um, does
Well,
it
I
annoy me?
mean,
No, it's understandable.
mm, but I mean, like it is quite. I mean, like it's so strange. I mean, you've got the same scriptures except for the Book of Mormon and the other Doctrine and Covenants, and yeah, so they don't have extra scriptures, so that might be a big difference. But I mean, it's I have to comment. There's a very interesting disperse of religions out there that follow the same text. How do they all come up with different ideas based on the same like text of writing?
Yeah, that question, that exact question was one of the causes of the emergence of the Mormon religion. The founder of Mormonism, Joseph Smith, expresses in some of his writings about how he started his religious pursuits. He mentions that the question about which religion was right and trying to answer that question by appealing to the Bible and realizing all of these Christian faiths interpreted the Bible differently, that's what sent him to seeking out a different avenue for understanding his role or his relationship with God, if you will. And of course, as Mormons, we look to that time also as that's when Joseph Smith went out and he had the first of his theophanies, his experiences of God. So the question, here we are, we have all these different Christian religions. We all appeal to the Bible. We all interpret it differently. Which of them is right? Um, if you talk to this is just straight, off the street Mormonism, mainstream Mormonism. You ask any Mormon, okay, how did your religion get started? Well, there was a 14-year-old boy named Joseph Smith who had the question, which religion is right? He read in the Bible that if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. He took that seriously. He went into a grove of trees and he prayed, and God answered his prayer and told him not to join any of the religions. That was the answer that Joseph Smith said he got, and
Mm,
eventually, of course, started his own,
right.
which he believed to be, and Mormons believed to be, a restoration. It's a restorationist movement, a restoration of the primitive Christian church. So, ideas about God that were lost, ideas about how the church should be organized that were lost, things along those lines were the claims that Joseph and Mormons make.
And it should be noticed that there's a few different versions of the Mormon Church now, even within.
That's
It's
right. There are
eh,
several Mormon denominations,
mm,
and those generally have, well, the first kind of schism in Mormonism. Well, Mormonism has always had lots of schisms, but the first major schism, I would say, happened when Joseph Smith was killed in Illinois. And at that time, Joseph
mm,
Smith's family broke off and started what is today the second largest grouping of Mormons, although they don't so much refer to themselves as Mormons, and that's the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or what they've changed their name to, which is the Community of Christ. Um, that's the second largest denomination today from Joseph Smith's original church. And then later on, when the LDS Church, the church of which I'm a member, which is much much larger than these other denominations, later on when the LDS Church gave up polygamy, there was another major schism period when a lot of people broke off. And so today, sometimes you'll see on the news that they'll have a whole bunch of polygamists in old-fashioned clothing, and they'll say that these people are Mormons. Well, yeah, these people do identify as Mormons, but it's a very small number of Mormons, and they're not part of, the mainstream LDS church. And those people broke off. Most of them broke off during this time when the mainstream LDS Church was giving up polygamy.
Mhm, mhm. Right. So, yeah, so it's interesting that there seems to be parallels between Mormonism and some of the other. Um, I get the sense there might be a parallel between the Unitarian Universalists in some way. Um, Now, because of links to Freemasonry, I think
Yeah,
Joseph Smith used to like belong or sort of share concepts with the Freemasons at one stage. Is that true?
that's right. Joseph Smith was a Mason. Many early Mormons were Masons. Brigham Young was a Mason. And there are Mormons to this day that are Masons. I don't think, and I don't have personal access to this information, so I could be wrong, but I don't think there are many of the primary leaders of the LDS Church today that are Masons, but I could be wrong. They may be. There's certainly nothing in our religion that prohibits people from being Masons. And I do have friends who are members of the LDS Church who are Masons. So yes, there is definitely a long history of Masonic influence on Mormonism, particularly in the early days of the church, and maybe a little bit today.
Okay. Is there any other like sort of organizations that you think influenced Joseph Smith and therefore the early and the early church?
Yeah, Joseph Smith, on one occasion, made a comment that I really like a lot. And he basically, the comment was that he was comparing himself to a mechanic, a skillful mechanic,
Hmm.
who would take together materials um, to build something like, say, a ship. And that if a skillful mechanic did that well, is that not deserving of praise? So Joseph Smith compared this to the work that he was doing in religion. He was taking bits and pieces from other places, such as the Bible, you know, such as elements of masonry, and I could appeal to other things too that had kind of predecessor ideas to what Joseph Smith came up with, and he brought them together in a skillful way. Now, he would also have claimed, and I would agree, that he did so in a way that was inspired, so that this was something of a divinely approved or a godly act. So, but no matter how you want to look at it, there's this idea that Joseph acknowledged himself that he wasn't coming up with new ideas out of just nowhere. He was pulling in bits and pieces from other traditions that had survived for maybe thousands of years in some cases,
Hmm.
such as the
Yes.
Bible.
And
And
and some people say the Freemasonry sort of some of the practices there has been sort of survived in some way through a long time. Yeah.
yeah, that's possible. Some people will say it goes all the way back to Solomon's temple. I don't know that there's strong evidence for that, but I do see that there's this evolution of esoteric ceremonies that the Freemasons inherited and maybe got from people like the Druids or the Rosicrucians
The
or
Druids.
the Templars
Yeah.
or the Pythagoreans. When you go back to the Pythagoreans, we usually think of Pythagoreans as mathematicians, but they were also an esoteric group
Sure.
with various rituals. And as I understand, and I'm not an expert in that area, but to the extent that I've looked into it, it seems to me that a lot of that esotericism kind of grew up around this practical need to protect knowledge that was very important. With the right math, you can throw very big boulders on your enemies and destroy them. So the Pythagoreans wanted to protect that math so that the boulders would be thrown on their enemies and not on themselves. So
Mm,
um,
sure. Or
there
something
there's
like
all
that.
kinds of reasons why, or something like that. Yeah, again, I'm not an expert there, but something along those lines is what I understand could have been
Mm.
involved. So
Okay.
yeah, those influences definitely have been around for a long time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of interesting. A lot of people believe or are mistakenly informed that some of the early animists or the early esoteric people were ascribed agency or the laws of nature to the whims of spirits, and there were no regularities really. And physics could change as we know it at any time according to the whim of anybody, any spirit, so to speak. So, but actually, a lot of I think it was Pythagoras who might have been an animist, or was it Aristotle? Yeah, a
There
number of
were
these.
I believe there
Uh,
were some pre-Socratics who were rather animistic. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So it's interesting. So they did have a kind of bit of science back then. Uh, not science as we understand today, not the scientific method, but sure they went out and tested things. They saw regularities in nature and decided, well, let's work on these and let's test them. It's not just maybe some of the paupers or the peasants who walked around thinking there were spirits in the trees and anything could happen at any moment. But the intellectuals within those areas, within the animistic areas, were not thinking like the peasants. They were thinking more mechanistically than we ascribe them to.
Oh yeah,
Um,
for sure.
so what is it about Freemasonry that Joseph thought interesting and brought to the LDS Church? Do you think?
Well, I can tell you what has survived of it. Generally speaking, the area where Freemasonry influenced Mormonism probably the most is in our temple rituals, and they're just aspects of Masonic esoteric ritual that were incorporated into Mormon esoteric ritual, which we do in our temples. And in Mormonism, we kind of distinguish between a temple and a church or a chapel. Churches or chapels are what we go to on a weekly basis to, for example, have Sunday school or to do the ritual. We call it the sacrament, but most people think of it as the communion, where we take bread and water to symbolize various aspects of the gospel of Christ. Catholics will take wine and wafers. But similar intents behind the symbols there. We do that on a weekly basis, but we go to our temples. We don't go to on different days. We don't go to the temple on Sunday. We go during the week. And in the temple, there's various rituals that we perform, like marriages or proxy rituals for the dead. Some people have this interesting, they hear about proxy rituals for the dead and they think of us digging up dead bodies and
And
putting them in.
resuscitating them.
Yeah, that's right. We don't do that, at least not
Okay.
yet. Maybe someday we'll resurrect people. You never know. But in any case, though, really it's a symbolic act. So in Christianity for thousands of years, there's been this idea that people can't go to heaven unless they're baptized. Well, the Mormon solution to that is, well, we'll baptize everyone, whether they're alive or dead. And so we have this proxy ritual where we'll baptize our ancestors who didn't have the chance to be baptized. And so one of the esoteric rituals that happens in the temple, I just mentioned, is baptisms by proxy for our ancestors. But another one that happens in the temple is called an endowment ritual, and that has a lot of similarities to Masonic rituals. Not as many similarities today as it had in the past. That's kind of evolved over time, but there are some strong similarities.
Excellent. So, like, it's interesting. The reason why I'm bringing up these questions is I thought there might have been a connection there between, like, well, where did the ideas of eternal progression come from? Was this a new idea within the Mormon Church, or did it come from somewhere like
Yeah.
the Masons, or yeah, was it influenced by any other society, religion, or organization, or
I,
writings?
I would say that the answer is yes. There were influences that brought these ideas to Joseph's mind, and probably served to help him become interested in them and inspired by the ideas and to share them with people. One of those influences may have been Masonry to an extent. There is this idea of progression in Masonry from level to level, and Mormons have a little bit of that idea. A very strong influence, though, on Joseph's idea of eternal progression comes from early Christians. Early Christians also had this idea that humans should become like God. That's not an idea that's brand new, that any contemporary interpretation of Christianity introduced. It was also a primitive Christian idea. Now, some early Christians kind of attacked that idea as heresy, but others embraced it fully and thought that that was a very important idea. As you can tell, because of how history has gone, that idea grew a lot weaker, but particularly in the Western hemisphere, Western Christianity. There's still a little bit stronger among Orthodox Christianity in the East. There's still a little bit more of this idea of apotheosis than in the Western Church, but it isn't as fully developed as it has become among Mormons, where we're quite explicit about this idea that we should learn to become gods. And so Joseph Smith would have claimed that some of his inspiration for this idea that we should learn to become gods, and we should be engaged in eternal progression, to have come from primitive Christians, from the original Christian views expressed by those Christians, and perhaps by Jesus himself. Jesus, you can read it in the Bible to this day, talks about, on one occasion, he's being harassed by the Jews for calling
Harassed.
himself, that's right, for calling himself the Son of God, and they're upset. They say, Jesus, you're a heretic.
How dare you,
That's
heretic!
right. And they want to kill
Burn
Jesus. And
him! Kill him! No, no, no.
exactly. Stone him in this case.
Stone him. Everybody must get
And
stoned, as
that's
Bob
right.
Dylan likes to say.
We need a good stoning from time to time. And so Jesus' response is, doesn't it say in your scriptures that ye are gods? And if the scriptures call them to whom, I'm not getting this word for word, but if the scriptures call you gods, why are you mad at me for calling myself the Son of God? And of course, they get even madder about it and they try to kill him. So that idea is there, and Joseph Smith found it in other locations, and you can find it in other writings of St. Athanasius or Origen or Clement, early Christian fathers. Those ideas are there to be had for people who will look and want to find them. So it's not a new idea to Joseph, and I think he was inspired by that.
What was Jesus referring to in the scriptures when he said, aren't you gods? Doesn't it say in the scriptures that you are gods? Is this an apocryphal thing, or is it actually in the Old Testament somewhere?
It's in the New Testament. Well, okay, so
Well,
it's
well,
in
well,
both.
Jesus' referral to the scriptures is in the New Testament, but what
That's right.
scriptures was he referring to?
It's the Psalms in
Oh,
the
okay.
Hebrew Bible. There's one of the Psalms references what may have been the judges of the land or the judges of the children of Israel at the time, um, as gods. It uses the words gods to reference them. Now, some people will interpret that differently, saying, "Oh, they don't mean the same kinds of gods that we might mean when we're talking about the object of worship." Well, okay, that's their interpretation. There, and I'm not an expert in the origins of that particular part of the text, but I think the case could be made that you know some people have different interpretations of gods, and they don't like it. Mormons happen to like that interpretation.
Yeah, well, what is interesting, if Jesus did bring it up in that context, if Jesus was saying, I'm the Son of God, and then he's being accused of heresy, and then he points to some scripture saying, well, you are, it's mentioned in the scriptures that you are gods, then why are you accusing me? It seems that, like, from that, my reading of that, Jesus might have been talking about this sort of interpretation. Anyway,
Yeah, you're
so
preaching to the choir on that one.
start singing.
That's right. No singing. You don't get that. You
Okay.
get an interview. No singing.
Oh, come on. Won't you sing us a hymn? I'm just
Another
kidding.
time. A
Another
follow-up
time.
interview.
All right. No worries. You're on. Okay. Okay. Well, so what is it? So, yeah. Okay. Well, there's now back to the interesting subject we brought up before about the relationship between some of the transhumanist thought and the Mormon Church, and why the Mormon Church seems to be, I guess, in some ways, like a very compatible, or vice versa, with the transhumanist teachings. So now, but there's not a lot of people who really see it this way in the Mormon Church. I'm not sure if there are like a large distribution of people who think opposite, who are like Luddites, but I'll really let you describe that. But yeah, so if the scriptures, like if your interpretation of the scriptures sort of relates a lot to the transhumanist writings or the transhumanist ideas, um, why is it you think that a lot of people don't see it the same things as you? Why are you interpreting these things as differently from the majority of Mormons in the
Yeah,
church?
good question. The first most important part of this is that most Mormons have never heard of transhumanism, just like most people have never heard of transhumanism. It's becoming more known than it was, say, a decade ago, but the majority of humans just have no clue. They've never heard of the word transhumanism or any explicitly transhumanist ideas. So that's the first issue. Mormons don't know about transhumanism. The second thing, when a Mormon first encounters transhumanism, you get various reactions. Some people love it immediately, and there are many of those kinds of people who are members of the Mormon Transhumanist Association. Um, some people are intrigued because it has some interesting ideas, but intrigued in a cautious way. They worry, I wonder what else this transhumanism is about, and whether would be compatible with all of my values and things along those lines. Because there are some very conservative values among a large portions of the membership of the Mormon religion, despite many of our very progressive theological ideas. A very small number, and it really is a very small number, of Mormons who encounter transhumanism for the first time have kind of that more hostile reaction that some more fundamentalistically inclined religious persons might have. And I would attribute that to the fact that Mormonism, like all religions, has been influenced by various strains of fundamentalist religious thinking. And so you'll find that kind of thinking in the Mormon religion, as you will in all religions, and you'll get those kinds of reactions at times. But my experience suggests that the likelihood of encountering that when exposing a Mormon to transhumanism is much lower than in most other religions.
Fair enough. Yeah, because I mean, there's already a background of eternal progression and yeah, well, there's been a number of Mormon inventors as well, from what I understand. I
Yeah,
think the TV was invented by a Mormon. Is that right?
the TV was, the artificial heart was invented by a Mormon. In
Thanks,
fact,
guys, for the TV. Yeah, that was a great
that's right.
invention.
The modern word processor was heavily influenced by Mormons. My own father was involved in that. Word Perfect Corporation was heavily influenced by Mormons. Founded here in Utah. Was the most popular word processor for many years until Word finally beat him in the market. And of course, today Word is the leading word processor. And there's a lot of other things we could list as well. Mormons have a very positive view of technology generally. It plays an important role in the kinds of things that we do. Even as part of our religion, we use technology heavily for our missionary efforts. We use technology as to kind of facilitate even our temple rituals. For example, I was talking to you earlier about all of those proxy baptisms for our ancestors. Well, all of that involves a lot of information technology to keep track of all of those names. And Mormons are very interested in genealogy as a consequence. We have massive databases filled with names of ancestors and names of everybody's ancestors, really. We're very good at genealogy. And technology plays a major role in enabling us to pursue those religious ends. So Mormons have for a very, go back to the pioneers. The pioneers relied on the technology of their day, even to survive the trek from the eastern United States into the West, and to survive in the West, and to build up a community here in a place that was just a very hostile desert environment. There were some pretty amazing feats of irrigation and other types of, maybe very primitive, our first start into terraforming type activities that happened here in Utah. So Mormons have valued and used technology for a very long time, and we continue to have a positive attitude toward it.
Nice. So let's just say Joseph Smith was alive today, and could see all the technology that was sort of ramping up around us, like mushrooms sprouting up. Do you think what's the likelihood that you think he would be a transhumanist or something similar?
I think he would certainly be a transhumanist. There's no question in my mind. And interestingly, and I'm quite serious about that. Of course, there are Mormons who would disagree with me. You'll always find controversial opinions about stuff like this. But one of the speakers at the recent conference of the Mormon Transhumanist Association gave a talk about Joseph Smith and about how Joseph Smith conceptualized the work he did in creating the Book of Mormon. I use the word create because the Book of Mormon is a very unique book in the way that it came about. And we often use the word translated the Book of Mormon when we talk about it as Mormons, but we never mean what most people mean by translation, because Joseph Smith didn't look at something and kind of just in any normal way say, okay, I see these characters in one language and I'm going to convert them into characters in English. That's not how it happened. And I won't go into all the details now because we could talk about it for a long time, but I encourage anybody listening to this recording, or you, Adam, to go and look at the speech that Don Bradley gave at the 2013 conference of the Mormon Transhumanist Association. And it talks about
Didn't he use
how...
a magic stone and a
Yes,
hat?
that's right. Well, that's how people refer to it, as a magic
Okay,
stone in
sorry.
a hat. No, that's fine. Joseph Smith would have called it a seer stone.
Yeah, that's right.
And the reason it was in the hat, according to Joseph Smith, was to block out light, because he was looking into this stone, and in the stone he would see characters or words that he would use as the text of the Book of Mormon, something along those lines. So Don Bradley gave a talk about this process and how, based on the historical evidence, how he thinks Joseph Smith was conceptualizing what was going on. And Don makes the argument in this speech that Joseph Smith was conceptualizing it in terms of technology, and makes the comment at the end of his presentation that, of course, Mormons would be the most likely of religious persons today to become transhumanists because their founder was a transhumanist. So that hopefully that'll pique the interest of some people that watch this to go look at Don Bradley's speech, where he talks about the way that Joseph Smith translated because it's not a usual translation claim, translated the Book of Mormon
So
and
he
its
actually
relation.
mentioned the word transhumanism in this
No,
talk. Okay. Sorry,
well, yeah, Don Bradley did at our conference, yes. Joseph Smith, of course, never mentioned transhumanism. It wasn't in his vocabulary.
Yeah, of course.
But Don Bradley, who's a member of the Mormon Transhumanist Association, in fact, a recently elected director of the association, he does talk about, based on the historical evidence, how he believes Joseph
Sorry.
Smith conceptualized the process.
So I'm confused. This is at your conference? I was
That's
thinking
right.
more. Okay, right, fair enough. I was thinking this was at some of the great Mormon meetings that they
Oh,
have
no, excuse me.
centrally.
Yeah, so let me clarify that
Never
a little
mind.
bit more. So at a conference just a few weeks ago, a member of the Mormon Transhumanist Association, he happens to be a very good historian of early Mormonism,
Yeah.
was appealing to the historical records about how Joseph Smith expressed his thoughts about how the translation process worked. So Don was comparing those thoughts that Joseph Smith put in place to the way that we conceptualize technology today, and drawing analogies between the two. Of course, in the 150 years since the time of Joseph Smith, technology has advanced a lot, but there are still analogous conceptualizations of the way things work. Joseph Smith was a naturalist, basically, is what Don Bradley is getting at in his analysis of Joseph Smith. And that naturalism and that application of tools to produce ends was already part of the Mormon idea of how things work from the time of its founder forward.
Okay, cool. All right, so well, let's drill down specifically into what parts of the Mormon sort of teachings, or what parts of the Mormon sort of ideas relate directly to transhuman ideas. Or relate, yeah, it doesn't actually. I should remove the word directly. Relate to, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, so first of all, you've mentioned a couple. One's eternal progression, and the other one's becoming gods. But are there any others that you think, any other parallels there that you think are high level parallels that you think are worth mentioning?
Yeah, there are a few that we could call out. One is on kind of the metaphysical level. Mormonism is a very physicalist, philosophically materialist ideology. For example, in Mormon scripture, when it talks about spirit, it explicitly calls out that there's no such thing as immaterial matter. That's a contradiction in terms, but it calls that out, and it says all spirit is matter. So, in many Christian traditions and many other religious traditions, there's this idea that there's something immaterial out there called spirit or soul or whatever you want to call it. In Mormonism, there is nothing immaterial. Everything is material. Everything is physical. And so that's a very important connection for Mormons to the scientific worldview, is that we're physicalists. So even when we talk about spirit, when we talk about spiritual things, we still have as an underlying metaphysical assumption that it's all material, it's all physical. this plays into something about God in Mormonism. Again, in most religions, in particular most Christian religions, God is an immaterial being. In Mormonism, not only is God a material being, God is an embodied being. And God in Mormonism also was once like us. So progressed in complexity from something like a human, maybe very much like a human. Most Mormons do think of God as having been a human. For me, humanoid or some similar complexity is sufficient. I don't insist so much on that, but humanoid, whatever. But Mormons generally think of God as someone who progressed from a human state to the state that God is now in, and that we can follow that same path, and that part of that path is transfiguring our bodies, either because they're transfigured while alive, or because they are resurrected to that transfigured state, to a glorified immortal state, something that's transcends our present notions of suffering and death, but nonetheless still embodied, still material. So that physicalism in our metaphysics provides a strong connection to scientific worldviews generally, but of course to transhumanism in particular, where we as transhumanists have this notion that we should use technology to enhance ourselves physically and mentally. But when we say mentally, we don't mean immaterially. We still recognize that there's physical correlates to all of our mental states. Most of us do, at least. And so there's a strong metaphysical connection. That's one parallel that I'll draw out there. And then actually, let me elaborate on that a little bit further. And that is, not only is God embodied, not only is spirit material, but for Mormons, this earth, this place, is supposed to become heaven. In many religions and many Christian interpretations, heaven is somewhere else, or it's not material. It's, something, wholly supernatural, immaterial. But in Mormonism, we expect that this earth should become heaven. So that also, an important thing about that is it makes Mormons rather non-escapist. We feel like we're supposed to work to make this world Zion, to make this world a celestial glory, to make this world heaven. And that also kind of brings in a tie into the transhumanist worldview, where there's this concern for using what we have at hand as practically as we can to make this world and our bodies and our minds better. That leads in turn into an idea in Mormonism called the dispensation of the fullness of times. And in Mormonism, we have in our scriptures this idea that God has progressively revealed to humanity throughout time greater knowledge and greater power to participate in the work of God. And that we now live in what's called the dispensation of the fullness of times, where all of the knowledge and power of God will be given out so that we can learn to become like God. And the scriptures, Mormon scriptures, include the prophecy of that before the dispensation of the fullness of times ends and the millennial world begins, which of course is a very typical Christian prophecy, that all of the laws of the natural world will be discovered by humanity. Well, of course, the way that it's expressed in scriptures is that God will reveal all of those natural laws to us. You can take that as happening through the scientific method if you want. That's how I interpret it. So that, of course, it parallels very well into transhumanism, particularly singularitarian notions of transhumanism, with this accelerating pace of knowledge acquisition, of information, where we've got this exponential curve going on in many areas of technology where, you've got Moore's law for processing, you've got the Moore's law for storage, you've got solar energy, which is on this solar production, which seems to be on an exponential curve. And, we could go on the list of what all of the people's favorite exponentials happen to be. Which and that correlates quite well with Mormon expectations that knowledge should progress rapidly in the time that we're currently living in. And then that culminates, of course, in kind of, for transhumanists, and at least for singularitarian transhumanists. Not all of us are singularitarians. But for those of us who are singularitarians, that kind of culminates in a technological singularity, or this time of, of technological progress, increases in complexity that we can't currently even comprehend, perhaps could not predict or control presently. Hopefully we'll be able to by that point. And a lot of people have very interesting apocalyptic and messianic notions associated with the technological singularity. There are singularitarians who think that the technological singularity will solve all of our problems because friendly AI will come and be essentially a god. Some people think that the technological singularity is extremely dangerous and it could cause, global catastrophic damage, and all these bad things could happen if we don't mitigate these risks. So there's also a very strong parallel there. These apocalyptic, messianic perspectives on the technological singularity parallel very well, not into just Mormonism, but many apocalyptic and messianic expectations in religion generally. Then, following that, a very strong parallel would be where we were talking about earlier with eternal progression and theosis, humans becoming gods. Among more, yeah,
Never mind. Yeah.
among the more radical transhumanists, which I most likely include myself, there's this idea that humans can progress to a post-human state where we are so radically advanced in our knowledge, in our power, and hopefully our compassion and our benevolence and our creative skills and beauty, just as much as anything else, um, where present notions of what it means to be human would no longer be fully applicable. We would have become post-humans. And in Mormonism, of course, there's this strong idea that God was once human, humans should become gods, and that God is not a human like we are today. God is radically creative, radically compassionate. And Mormon scriptures include, we've talked about how God is embodied and, has this glorified body, but Mormon scripture also includes these ideas where, if you look into the heavens, you are seeing God, but you have not understood. So not only do we have this notion of, like the kindly old grandfather in the sky, perhaps, except, glorified body and all, but we also have these notions that there's something about this body of God that's a lot different from the body that you and I now have. And Mormon scripture kind of gets into what some of those differences might be, and people interpret it in different ways. But we do have this sense in which we do expect that humanity will progress to become like God, and that we will continue to be embodied, but we will be glorified in ways that perhaps we don't fully understand right now. And that parallels very strongly with expectations of post-humanity.
Yes. So there's a couple of questions which fall out for what you just asked. One's an extension of what would Joseph Smith think about transhumanism, and the other one is, well, it seems as though like nowadays it's very clear to see that technology is a major influence in society, and it's going gangbusters. But how much have the current leaders of the Mormon Church taken notice of this, and what are they suggesting? I get the impression that they don't really know that the Mormon Transhumanist Association is there, but they might have their own sort of perspectives on technology growth cycles, and some of the the powers that we have with technology today, and the great powers of technology tomorrow.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I don't think that. So Mormonism is quite a, we're not a small religion anymore. We're not as big as, say, Catholicism or whatever. There's some gigantic religions on the planet, but as religions go, we're also not tiny. We're a large religion. So there's lots of different kinds of Mormons. Even in the LDS Church, people interpret things different ways. There's groups of feminist Mormons. There's groups of Mormons that are concerned about the environment. There's groups of Mormons that care a whole lot about studying the historicity of the Book of Mormon. There's groups of Mormons about this and that and the other. There's lots of groups of Mormons that enjoy exploring different aspects of our religion. So, of course, the authorities of the LDS Church can't keep up with being familiar with all of these groups. There's just so many of them. So it's possible that some of them have heard of the Mormon Transhumanist Association. They were probably confused by the name because they don't know what transhumanism means. but there may also be some who have some familiarity with it. I do know that there's probably at least one or two that I'm pretty confident know about the Mormon Transhumanist Association because I'm indirectly acquainted with them and either their spouses or things like that. So they know that we exist, but that's not their focus. Their focus is on managing a very large church and trying to do so in a way that's spiritually uplifting for millions of people. And the focus of the LDS Church itself is certainly not on technology per se. The focus of the LDS Church, if you would ask, any mainstream Mormon, is to preach the gospel of Christ. Faith, repentance, baptism, this idea that we should take on the identity of Christ as exemplified by Jesus and be good Christians, love each other, have compassion, serve each other. That really is the focus of the LDS Church, and I think that is the appropriate focus of the church. That said, the church does have generally very favorable opinion of technology, although I wouldn't say that they are Pollyanna-ish about technology. You'll occasionally hear leaders of the church warn about the risks that are associated with technology. And I think that's a very intelligent thing to do because technology can also be used in some very stupid ways. So, technology can be used for good. It can be used for evil. It can be used stupidly, intelligently. And Mormonism recognizes all of that, and Mormon leaders tend to recognize all of that, although I would say they don't have a strong familiarity with transhumanism. It's not a thing that they're acquainted with.
Hmm. Given technology growth curves and the likelihood of us achieving amazing things with technology in the future, uh, would you expect the focus on technology in general, maybe not under the moniker of like transhumanism, but focus on science and technology in general will be a growing focus within the Mormon Church?
Yes, I do expect that will be the case. And in fact, in my lifetime, I've noticed that it has received increasing attention from discourses given by leaders of the LDS Church over the years. And I expect that will become increasingly the case because it'll be increasingly hard to ignore just how profound the trajectory of technology is. And I expect, and this is partly why the Mormon Transhumanist Association exists, I expect the ideas of Mormon transhumanists will help influence the ideas of other Mormons around us and help shape the way that we approach these sorts of questions. And my hope is that we're doing this in a way that will make our approach to it optimistic and healthy, not ignoring real risks that are present, but also not doing any kind of fundamentalist, reactionary, knee-jerk, oh, this is all going to go really bad quickly, but showing how our theology, our tradition, our rich cultural history has already been deeply influenced by positive embrace of technology, how our theology should encourage us to inspire to continue using it wisely, ethically, and inspired, beautiful ways, and that it can be a very positive force within and for our religion. So that, there's many reasons why the MTA exists, but that is one of the important ones, is we do want to help shape that conversation within our own faith.
Hmm. That's, yeah, good. So you mentioned, well, hmm. No, there seems to have been like a religious right sort of opposition to technological progression. Um, and some of the very concerned with like the idea of having technology replace human function, or maybe even replace the image of God, and are averse to the ideas based on the idea that God created man in His image, and that if we try to deviate from the image that God created, that's an affront to the the Holy Spirit, or what God thinks we should be doing.
Yeah.
Perhaps not the Holy Spirit, because I think that's pretty much him. Or yeah. Anyway, so yeah, so there seems to be a backlash against the like, for instance, stem cell therapy,
Yeah.
or the research with embryonic stem cells, and other forms of technology. So, what do you think the common take is within the church Is there any official take on like cautions against particular technologies? I get the impression that it's not a blanket technology is bad thing within the Mormon Church, but can you elaborate on what the
Yeah,
do's and don'ts are officially within the church and what people are believing in? And is there like a far right Luddite movement going on? Well, actually, it wouldn't. Yeah. Anyway.
yeah. There's certainly not a strong Luddite movement in Mormonism. There certainly are some Luddites. There are Luddites in every ideology, just about. There's
Yeah.
even
Sure.
Luddite transhumanists.
Yeah. So yeah, there's like
Even
the
know
the
how they
ultra left
exist.
Luddites and the ultra right conservatives. I've got the terms mixed up there for a second. Yeah.
But yeah. So in the LDS Church, there are no official policy like that against any kind of technology. In fact, if you go to the LDS Church website, you can find a statement about stem cell research, which explicitly says the church takes no position on stem cell research. And um, for example, one of the influential senators in the stem cell research debates in the United States government was a Mormon, and he was pro stem cell research. And I know lots of Mormons who are pro stem cell research while we're talking about that particular subject. So there are also Mormons who don't like stem cell research for various reasons. So there's not a religious, there's not a strong, at least not a strong denominational influence on Mormons' positions on stem cell
Cool.
research. When you get into other areas like let's say technologies for reproduction, there are many Mormons who use reproductive technologies to try and help them have babies. Having children is very important in the Mormon tradition, and we don't avoid using technology to help us do that. I have lots of friends who have used technology to either actually have babies or to try, and maybe they weren't successful, unfortunately, after spending a lot of money. That's sad. But you know, we're not opposed to using technology in that area. Um, we have many Mormons who are scientists, and as we talked about that earlier, software engineering and programming and information technology is very big among Mormons. We have a strong software industry in Utah. I've been in that industry for my entire professional career. My father was in that industry. I've got lots of family and friends in that industry. And in fact, Google recently decided to put Google Fiber in Provo, Utah, in part because of the
Lucky
strong.
you.
That's right. Lucky us. And I suppose that's at least in part, it's probably not the whole story, but in part because of some of the strength of the software industry in the local area. Um, so yeah, I think that even the denominational inclination there is positive, or just kind of staying out of the way and letting
Mm,
people make decisions about how to apply technology. Now, there will all Mormons, both leaders and lay members, will always caution that all of these things should be done in ways that are ethical. We'll very commonly hear Mormons saying to each other, are you using this in an inspired way? Does it feel right? Things like that, right? We care a lot about the aesthetics of it, and what I mean by aesthetics is the spirituality of it. That's important to Mormons, but encouraging each other to pray about it and to think of things in ethical terms. That doesn't necessarily mean that we should or should not be doing these things. The question is, how do we approach these things thoughtfully, wisely, in inspired ways? Those are the kinds of questions you'll get from
mm,
Mormons, not the
mm,
knee-jerk reaction, oh, this is bad.
mm, mm. All right. And I was going to ask about apocalyptic thinking and transhumanism. Uh, do you think it's it's good to have apocalyptic thinking? Does that inspire good thinking within the transhumanist movement? Is that something that we can take from Mormonism, if that's what happens in Mormonism? Are there goods and bads? Would you like to discuss that?
There are definitely both goods and bads. There's two kinds of apocalyptic thinking, and one is terrible, and one I think to a degree is healthy. The terrible one is the fatalistic thinking, and it happens both among transhumanists and among some Mormons. And that is this idea that, the technological singularity is inevitable and it will be good. That's one form of it, right? No matter what we do, it's coming, it's going to be wonderful, it'll solve all of our problems forever. There's also the technological singularity is coming, and it most likely will kill us all because the AIs will take control, and humans are going out. We are going into the dustbin of the past for sure. So there's either the very positive or the very negative, fatalistic, apocalyptic interpretations of the technological singularity. The same thing happens in religion all the time, of course. There's the idea that God is, Jesus is returning tomorrow and all of the sinners are going to burn in hell, and maybe if the rest of us will go to heaven. And there's, even the very Calvinistic interpretations, and this isn't, there's very little of this in Mormonism, but among some religions, there's this very Calvinistic interpretation where God already knows who he's going to send to hell, who he's going to send to heaven. No matter what you do, it doesn't really matter. So there's a very fatalistic approach that some people take to the technological singularity or to prophecy. I think that's bad across the board, whether you're a transhumanist or whether you're a religious person. There's another approach to apocalypticism and to eschatology, and that is this idea that there are very real risks and there are very real opportunities, profound risks and profound opportunities that present themselves to us, and that we have a duty to take them seriously and to mitigate those risks and to pursue those opportunities. That, I think, is a very important form of apocalypticism, that we do have opportunities and risks before us that nobody in the history of humanity has had before them. I think it's healthy to recognize that possibility, to think about it, to debate it, to consider it, to figure out how to shape it and form it, maybe direct it as best possible for humans and human civilization and for our flourishing. So if that's apocalypticism, is to recognize that we have challenges in front of us and opportunities in front of us that are more serious and more wonderful than ever before, that's a healthy apocalypticism. But it's not fatalistic. And this can be applied to prophecies as well. Some religious people, Mormon and otherwise, will look at prophecies, say in the Bible, and say, this is what's going to happen at the end of the world. Well, I would caution them that, remember, in your Bible, there's also this story of Jonah who goes to Nineveh and tells Nineveh that they're going to be destroyed. And guess what Nineveh does? Well, as the story goes in the Bible, Nineveh repents and God doesn't destroy them. And Jonah is really angry at God because he didn't destroy them. Jonah had told Nineveh that they were going to be destroyed, and now he looks stupid because they weren't destroyed. And so the message of that, as far as I'm concerned, is, hey, the Bible itself tells you that even though there are these prophecies about risks at the end of the world or opportunities, these prophecies should be understood more as forthtellings rather than foretellings. These are prophecies that could happen if we don't avoid the risks, or if we do pursue the opportunities. This is what lays before us as opportunity, the kind of world that we could create, or in the negative cases, the kind of world that we hopefully will avoid. And so I think that's a much more healthy way of looking at the prophecies of the scriptures. We don't want a worse world. We want a better one. So let's avoid the worse world. Let's work with each other to make the world a better place. And then we can live in that better place. We can make it that heaven that we've so long desired. I think that's a much healthier way to approach apocalypticism.
Interesting. So is there anything specifically that you think the Mormon sort of faith, other than, converting, because I'm sure that's obvious, but other than converting, is there anything that the Mormon faith or the Mormon tradition or the Mormon Transhumanist Association can actually bring to the general transhumanist singularity discussion to help mitigate the risks? What is it about apocalyptic thinking that you think the Mormon Transhumanist Association could bring to the conversation that would help?
Yes. Here's a big one for you. This I'm pretty passionate about, and I do talk with other transhumanists a lot about. And that is, there is among some transhumanists a either strident or lingering anti-religiosity. And that anti-religiosity does not serve our purposes. It creates divisions. Most people in the world, at least for now, and maybe for a very long time, depending on how trends go, are going to identify as religious in one form or another. And by being merely anti-religious, we're not doing ourselves any favors in our relationships with other people and in our attempts to spread what good ideas we do have. So one of the things that I think Mormon transhumanism brings to transhumanists and to transhumanism as a movement generally is a caution that, listen, you do not have to be anti-religious. There are religious people like us who have similar ideas with you, who want to work with you, who want to be friends with you, who want to pursue the same opportunities that, or similar opportunities that you see, and who see similar risks that you see. You know, our ideas will vary from person to person, and frankly, even among the anti-religious, ideas about transhumanism vary from person to person. So it's not the fact that there's variance that should prevent us from working together. So the Mormon Transhumanist Association very starkly illustrates the fact that there is no need to be indiscriminately anti-religious as a transhumanist. There are still, of course, are some transhumanists who are anti-religious, and to them I'd suggest, listen, you're just working against yourselves in this. You're never going to convince everybody to be anti-religious like you. Many of us have deep spiritual, personal, subjective, admittedly, reasons in many cases for being religious people. And there's no reason why you should fight against that. You can still argue on behalf of rationality. You can still argue on behalf of science and logic and technology and reason. And you can do it without being necessarily anti-religious. There are ways of doing this. And the Mormon transhumanist suggests and proposes and illustrates some of those ways.
Excellent. So now, because this is a linear discussion, I couldn't really fit this in previously. Um, if so it seems as though there's a lot of people out there that do believe that there is a different magisterium for supernatural, and maybe within that is contained a separate magisterium for just natural.
Yeah.
Now, the Mormons believe that everything is just natural, as far as I understand your interpretation.
Yeah, you'll find Mormons who have various perspectives, but most Mormons, if you talk to them, most mainstream Mormons will say something along the lines of, yeah, God operates according to natural laws. God is an embodied being. Now, we as humans may not understand how all of those natural laws can be leveraged in different ways. You know, Arthur C. Clarke comes to mind, right? You know, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So Mormons are not going to reject the miraculous as a phenomenon, but most Mormons will tell you that, you know, although there are miraculous phenomenon potentially in our experience, there are explanations for how these things function, and we can learn to perform those same miracles, and we will learn, hopefully, to perform those same sorts of miraculous things, even up to the point of, you know, as I would say, learning to become gods ourselves, doing the kinds of acts that a God would do. And, you know, Jesus in the New Testament said himself, he invited his disciples to raise the dead. And if we can ultimately learn how to do that, then I'm on board.
And it seems like there's a difference in the way that the two types of thinking would inform attitudes to technology, progress, and well, transhumanism, I guess. So, like, what would you see the difference between somebody who thinks like supernatural, like the supernatural, supernature exists in a completely unfathomably different magisterium that can't be reached from our perspective, compared to a naturalist interpretation of the world?
Of course, I can't prove the immaterial doesn't exist. I can't prove an immaterial God doesn't exist. I can't disprove supernaturalism, whatever that even is supposed to mean. I'm not even sure it's a coherent idea. Um, but that's okay. You know, for all practical purposes, you know, if it can affect me, then it's natural. That's how I look at it. And if it's supernatural, if it has no influence on my experience, then why should I worry about it? So um, I'm rather pragmatically inclined myself, and as a pragmatist, you know, I try to ask myself what's the practical value of thinking in one way versus another. If I think in supernatural terms, how will it affect my behavior, what I do? If I think of natural terms, how will it affect my behavior? And it seems to me that there are very strong practical benefits to thinking in natural terms and thinking, okay, if I want to become as God is now, what should I do to get to that state of being? Are there things I can do, steps I can take, acts I can perform, works I can do, actions? And it's not, remember, this isn't all just about, enhancing the power of my body or my mind. There's also these questions of ethics and compassion. How can I treat my neighbor differently tomorrow so that I can be more compassionate as I imagine God to be? And so by thinking of all of these things in natural terms, I'm personally, and I think many people are like this way, but at least me personally, I'm more inclined to actually do the natural acts that I as a natural person can do to become like that. And that has a positive influence on me. I believe I'm a better person for thinking that way, not just because I'm a better thinker in rational terms, but I'm also a nicer person because of it. A more loving, kinder person, a better neighbor to the person who lives next door to me because of it. And I'm far from perfect. I try to improve, but thinking in these ways helps me, so far as I can tell, as based on what introspection I've done, to be a better person.
Okay, cool. So yeah, do you think that there'd be like I guess, population effects if there was, like for instance, a religion which, as a tenet, as a dogma, says that God exists and miracle exists in a completely separate magisterium of supernatural. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that over time, I think that as science and technology continue to increase in the scope of what they're able to explain and do, that those appeals to that supernatural God are going to, I call it the incredibly shrinking God of the gaps. That's where it's going to go. The benefit of thinking, another benefit of thinking of God as I've described to you, is that the only way to disprove the God that I'm talking about with you right now is to become that God ourselves. But by becoming that God ourselves, that God exists. We realize that God. So it's very hard to disprove. There's not this incredibly shrinking God of the gaps problem when you understand God in terms of post-humanity.
Mm.
And there's also a lot of practical benefits because when you think of it in natural terms, you take steps to get there. Now, another thing to talk about in terms of this, God being outside of, the natural world, there's still room inside of certain naturalistic interpretations of the world for a God that is transcendent in various ways. And the multiverse concept, the simulation argument concept, and related concepts can inform very natural understandings of a God that's transcendent in various ways. Sometimes when talking with fellow Mormon transhumanists about theology, we'll talk about the trends in technology and the intimacy with which technology is being integrated into our minds and bodies. Years ago, the computers were in giant warehouses far away, and then they got smaller and they moved into our houses, and they got smaller and they moved into our pockets and our phones and into our bodies. So our technology and our bodies are becoming increasingly indistinguishable. So when we look into the far distant future and we imagine post-humanity and their computers, we shouldn't think of post-humanity and their computers as being separate things. Post-humanity is the computer. The computer is post-humanity. They have merged at that point. And so when I think of an embodied God, and when I'm thinking of this embodied God in terms of post-humanity, and I think of that embodied God creating a world, and let's say, for sake of argument, there's other ways we could talk about this, but let's say for sake of argument that God is creating our world through some kind of advanced simulation technology. Where are we in relation to that God? Well, we're inside of that God, like software is inside of a computer. We're part of that God, and that doesn't make the God supernatural, but that does make the God rather transcendent in some very practically important ways. It actually becomes quite meaningful to think of God as being everywhere around us. But it also makes perfect sense to talk about God being embodied still. It's just embodied maybe in a different sphere than the one in which we find ourselves. So there, and I'm not telling you that that's necessarily how things are. I'm telling you, some Mormon transhumanists, including myself, might think in those terms or something along those lines at some times. But there are many ways to skin the naturalistic cat, so to speak. And I just find them all much more practically useful than the supernatural cat.
Is there any, okay, have you has it come have you ever decided on any sort of limit to the amount of the amount of progression you'd be willing to make with technology, or the nature of the progression that you'd take with technology? Is there certain forms of technology which you would not use in order to extend your capability?
Well, so in Mormonism, we tell a story about a war in heaven that happened prior to this world existing. And in that war in heaven, there were contending plans proposed to God for how to create our world. One of the plans that was proposed was that we should create a world with agents that can act for themselves, that have moral agency, that can make real choices with real consequences, and can experience both the joys and the sorrows that come along with that. But unfortunately, because of that, some of them would experience terrible things. And then the other plan that was proposed was no, 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 no. We're not going to allow them to be agents like that, because then there will be too much suffering and we'll lose too many of them. No, we're going to create a world in which basically, I don't know, if we're something like zombies. That's not the word we, of course, use in our scriptures. I'm just kind of relating it to you. So with these two proposing plans, as the story goes we're describing kind of this pre-mortal um, existence. As the story goes, there was a war between these two factions in heaven, and the faction that wanted us not to have agency lost the war, and the faction that wanted us to have moral agency and to be able to come and experience both sorrow and joy won, and we were placed here as agents by God to learn and progress and to become like God. So um, now I'm forgetting kind of where your question went. Remind me.
Well, I was discussing is there any
Oh,
pathway in
limits.
technology, or is there any limits, not only to the
Limits.
extent but the nature of technology?
Yeah, so that's why I brought this up, is that so Mormons hold to this notion that this war that began before this world was created continues now and will perhaps culminate in some very nasty or very wonderful results in the future, distant or not. And a lot of that war focuses on how we use power. Now, we don't necessarily use the word technology. In fact, you'd have a hard time finding the word technology in our scriptures. It's just not there. But we talk in terms of power, and technology as a form of power, and how power is used. Will power be used to compel people to act in certain ways or do certain things or to be certain things? Or will power be used in a compassionate way that liberates each other, that builds each other up, that gives people opportunity for growth and godhood, for the creative and compassionate capacity of godhood? And so, of course, Mormon scripture is strongly in favor of the latter use, which uses power to help each other and to give each other opportunity and growth. And it's very opposed to the former use of power, which is to compel people and to narrow their possibilities and such. So I'd suggest that, yes, there would be limits to how we should use technology and how Mormons will feel comfortable using technology. And those limits will be identified and debated along the lines of how our sense of ethics informs our sense of how technology should be used, how our religious stories and mythos informs our worldviews. All of those things will come into play into helping us determine, should I use this pill or not? What does this pill do? Is it helping us become more free? Is it helping us become more creative, more compassionate, better people? Is it helping us flourish? Or is it helping us become, kind of, just robotic, right? In the negative sense of the term, because transhumanists also have some positive spins on robots. Or more of a zombie. If technology is is being applied in ways that do that, well, then yeah, we shouldn't go there. So yes, I do think there certainly are moral and ethical and spiritual and aesthetic limits to how technology should be used and applied and pursued. And Mormonism will inform, of course, my view on that. I'm a Mormon, and that's inescapable. And religions generally will inform people's views on all of these things.
Sure. So I mean, like, I guess different ideologies on how to run a society or how to run like a planet might come into play. Do you think God is a libertarian? Do you
Yeah.
like is it more like do you think he's a libertarian socialist, libertarian like a free market sort of anything goes thing,
Yeah.
a benevolent authoritarian, or somewhere as a mixture between those, or even like a left wing sort of democratic socialist, or what do you think?
Yeah. Uh, Great questions. I personally identify as a libertarian socialist. And of
Hmm.
course, we all think, anybody who believes in God, of course, thinks that God is the same political ideology as he or she, him or herself. So, of course, I think that God's a libertarian socialist. There are many Mormons who are market libertarians, right-leaning libertarians, which I'm not. Um, there are some of us, but a smaller number, who are libertarian socialists. There are a small number of progressive Mormons. There are a large number of conservative Mormons. Most Mormons tend to be conservative politically these days. That hasn't always been the case. In fact, we have a rich history of progressive Mormons, but for reasons that would take longer to describe, that shifted in the late 20th century. Although we're shifting away from the extreme conservatism of the late 20th century, now we're experiencing more of a shift back towards moderacy, I find. But that's ongoing. And so, what is God? Well, Joseph Smith had lots of interesting ideas about what God is, and Joseph Smith being the founder of Mormonism, I suppose his ideas should count for something in all of this. Joseph encouraged Mormons to embrace various rather communitarian concepts. Mormons experimented with communal living, with communal property, um, and that was encouraged not just by Joseph Smith, but also by Brigham Young, who was Joseph Smith's successor into Utah. We had various cities that were founded on communitarian concepts of sharing of property. Of course, Mormons experimented with polygamy, and so Mormons have a history of unusual or experimental social practices that aren't, of course, very common among Mormons today, who tend to be quite conservative on the whole. But it's there. It's in our religious tradition. It's there in our scriptures. So there are places there that will inform Mormonism for as long as Mormonism exists. And so I think we'll continue to see those aspects of Mormonism influencing how Mormons behave and make choices going forward, even if there are some Mormons who don't like those aspects of our history.
Okay. Well, so in the general population, there seems to be a lot of conservativeness, as you suggested, but it seems as though that's also the case in the Mormon Church, not just in the general population. Um, about like especially when it comes to what it means to be human, and there seems to be some sort of crossing of what are considered to be clear boundaries between what it means to be human and what it means to be what is wrong. Okay, so
Yeah.
do you think a lot of Mormons really think that it's sinful to transgress that image of God, that imago Dei, or whatever that means? Are we meant to maintain the image of God that we have now? What about genetic enhancement of offspring through
Yeah.
germline therapy? Is that considered to be evil and bad?
Yeah,
And
good question.
what are your thoughts?
You know, um, the LDS Church has no position on genetic engineering, germline or otherwise, and and Mormonism itself. Most of our scriptures originate, 100 years ago or more, going into the past, and then going forward from that time forward, we do have leaders of the church whose writings and speeches we still consider scriptural, or not quite scriptural, but approaching scriptural levels of authority today. So people do talk about these things, but looking backward in our scriptures, of course, we don't have a lot of mention of genetic engineering in the scriptures because nobody knew what that was. So we can speculate about maybe what Joseph Smith would have thought about it, but it would be speculation. Leaders of the LDS Church today have said very little about genetic engineering, germline or otherwise. So I would there again, I could only speculate about their positions. My personal perspectives, I'll share those, and of course they're informed of the fact that I'm a Mormon myself, but shouldn't be construed as like doctrinal for or policy of the LDS Church because it's not. Basically, I think that germline engineering is kind of a waste of time because it's pretty slow. And if we
Mm-hmm.
want to enhance ourselves,
You
as
need
most
somatic
transhumanists
genes,
do,
yeah. Yeah.
yeah, we need bigger we need bigger changes than germline changes. So I just on practical grounds, I'd say germline engineering, genetic engineering is not worth a whole lot of focus, except maybe in some cases where we there may be some defects in our DNA that are just so egregiously terrible to the people who receive them that maybe we do want to give some attention to that just to avoid some of that suffering. But more importantly, though, we want to solve those problems for people who are already alive. So I'm very strongly in favor of cautious genetic engineering of living humans, in an environment of consent, of well-informed consent, and with careful consideration for its effects on people around each of us, on the effects on our society. Of course, there's all kinds of risks and concerns that we should take into account. But I'm in favor. I'm in favor of the exploration. I'm in favor of what benefits could be found there. But I'm aware that there are also risks that we should be concerned about. Um, my battery on my laptop is about to go dead. Let me grab my recharger, and I'll be right back.
Hey, look, if you want a
Oh yeah,
break, we can have a 10-minute break or something like that. Do you want to do that? Because I'd like a break too.
yeah,
And then, like, I can just upload two separate parts.
yeah. No problem.
All right, no
I'll be
worries.
back. Be back in a few minutes.
Yeah, cool. I'll be back soon.